Hey, and welcome to the second part of this video. In the first part of this video, we looked into the theory of networking and how we can use APIs to make sure that we get the data that we need from certain servers or databases. In this second part of the video, we will take a look at a practical example of using such a public API. In this case, we'll use the JokeAPI so that we can return the user with a funny joke. Let's start up Android Studio and start programming. So we've started up Android Studio, and as you can see, I've already made the layout. By now in the course you should know how to do this, so I've skipped this part. But our layout consists of one button and one text view that we'll use to display the joke in. Now let's look at the more interesting stuff for using our APIs. The first thing what we want to do when dealing with APIs is making sure that we have the right permissions. And that's something we do in our manifest file, if you remember that from a previous lecture. So we'll add here users permission, and the permission that we need is the permission to use internet. If we also want to be able to check our network state, for example, we can also add the permission to access network state. Secondly, we want to make sure that we'll be able to use the volley library. And this is something we have to add in our build.gradle and then the module part. So we'll go there and we'll add the implementation of com.volley. It suggests it to us, and then we sync our Gradle files. Whilst that is syncing, let's look at our actual API. So often you'll find your API and your API has some form of documentation. And once we have this URL, not every type of documentation shows us the way they send the data to us. So then a handy tool we might be able to use is something that we can call Postman. On Postman you can create a free account and then open your own workspace. And what this allows you to do is to check out certain requests. So let's use a GET request. We enter the URL that we just found and then we say send. And then Postman will show us the response. So in this case we see that the type is two-part. It shows us a category, an error message. Then if the two-part happens, we have a setup and a delivery. And those are the important things for us to know right now, because this is what we use to properly unpack our joke into what we want. Okay, so knowing that, let's look into our actual main activity. The first thing I want to do here is initialize some variables, namely the text view, which is the joke view, and I want to initialize a request queue, and I'll just call that one queue. This request queue is part of the volley documentation, and once we create the queue, it will create worker threads for us. If you remember from the multi-threading lecture, we said that networking always has to be done on a different thread, and volley makes sure with this queue that this is done. So we don't have to make the thread ourselves. It's quite handy. So then in the onCreate, let's hook the text view to the actual layout. Let's set up the queue. So queue is volley.newRequestQueue. This gives us an error because we have to give it some context. So the context will give this. And then finally, let's set up the functionality of the button. Okay, so let's think about what needs to happen when we press that button to find the joke. We've already set up the queue, so that's something we don't have to do. What we do have to do is initialize the URL that we want to find our joke on. So let's initialize that. Then if we remember our response from Postman, we saw that this is a JSON object. So in order to request this, we can create a JSON object request, and let's call it joke request is new JSON object request. I think I did a mistype here. Okay, so let's look at this object request. What does it need? First of all, it needs a request method. So we'll say request.method and we'll use the get method because we're only interested in getting data. Secondly, we need to give it the URL. Thirdly, we have to specify if it's a JSON request, so we'll say null there. Now we need to give it a listener. So in this JSON object request, if we get a response, that will be of a form JSON object. Obviously, with this response, we want to output some form of string to the text view. So let's do this in a one-liner. So jokeview.setText, and that requires a string. So let's create a function that returns that string. So let's call that one getJoke, and we'll feed that function the response. This function we'll make later. Let's first look at what we need in the JSON request, because what we finally need is an error listener. We can make that the same way. And if we get an error, I just want to return this to the text view. So in this case, we'll set the text and we'll say something went wrong, try again. And we can extract that to a string resource. So our only error now is that we don't have that getJoke function. So let's make that private. It returns a string. We call it getJoke, and we feed it a JSON object. So let's start by initializing the string that we want to return. So string joke. That's initialized. That's all we need to do. So if we remember now from the response and the documentation of the JokeAPI, we know that we can get two types of jokes. Either it's a single line, or it's a two-liner with a setup and a delivery part. So let's make a if-else statement that will see which one of the two it is, and depending on it, we'll handle it a little bit differently. But first, what we have to do when we try and parse something from a JSON object is put it in a try-catch clause, because something might go wrong, and then we have a catch in case of the JSON exception. Okay, so in that try, let's make the if statement. So in this if statement, we want to check if the joke object has the type single. So let's say joke object dot get string, and that is the string type dot equals, and then where the name equals single. So if the type string equals single, we'll go into this statement. So what will we do then? Well, it's simply setting the joke as the string that we've got provided. So joke is joke object dot get string, and that's the string called joke. Now we get these squirrely lines because we don't have the catch clause yet. If we alt enter, we'll see that we automatically get the catch clause, but I want to add a little bit more here, because if something goes wrong, I want the user to know that it has gone wrong. So in this case, let's also say that joke equals something went wrong in the parsing. Try again. So that is our error and our single joke done. Now let's look at the two-line joke. So that is our else statement. And in this case, I'm going to use a string builder. This we can use to create longer strings in an easy way. So let's call it joke builder is new string builder. And in this string builder, I can use the append method to append new forms of string to the existing string. So let's say joke builder is joke builder.append, and there we have to input what we want to append to it. So that is the joke object.get string, and the string will be called setup. That's our first part of the joke. Now I want to separate this in the string by appending a enter. And we do that by using the \n. And now finally, I want to add the delivery. So we'll say joke builder.append again, and then joke object.get string, and we'll say delivery. Then finally, since we output a joke and not a joke builder, we want to say joke is joke builder, and there's a simple method that we call toString, And there we have our joke as a string. Now, the final thing we need to do in this function is add the return. So we'll return joke. So now joke is returned to the set text here, which will make sure that the joke is displayed in the text view. Now we only have one thing left to do, because if you remember, we initialized the queue here. And with everything that we multi-thread, we often also want to make sure that we cancel it when we go out of the application to make sure that we save resources. So by hitting Ctrl O, we get a list of all the methods that are overwritable. So now I want to look for the onPause lifecycle callback. If you don't remember what a lifecycle callback is, I recommend you to look at the theory video about activities. There we go into detail on that. So this method is called when we go out of the application. And what we want to add here is that we say queue.cancelAll. And there we have to give it a tag. We'll just give the tag this. So if I'm correct, this should be all. So let's run it in our emulator and see what it looks like. So my Pixel 5 unfortunately does not work today, but this gives me the opportunity to tell you why I have different kind of emulators. It's often the case that you design your app for some sort of screen size. In this case, when I was testing my app, I found out that it was resizable, but it didn't work for very small screens. So with the different kind of emulators, you can test for different screen sizes, which allows you to make sure that your layouts work for every kind of telephone. So now let's see, the app has started. Let's see if it works. If we hit go, we see that nothing happens. I've done some debugging and I found out what I did wrong. As we come here to our joke request, we published the joke request, but we never add it to the queue. So let's say queue.add, and we have to add the joke request here. And once we do that, we rerun it on the emulator, and we see that the JokeAPI returns us a joke. I hope you learned something in this video, and that you can use this to start creating your own applications using APIs. For now, I wish you a lot of fun with creating your own applications, and hopefully see you in the next video.